So I want to say thank you to Mark for leading our children's address this morning. So Mark, thank you. Janet's going to read our lesson this morning as we look at John chapter 5. We've been doing that over these past number of weeks, looking at people who encountered Jesus and how their lives were totally transformed. And that's exactly what we're going to look at this morning. A man who's been lying on a mat for 38 years. But Janet's going to bring that story to us.
Good morning. Our reading this morning is taken from the Gospel of John, the 5th chapter, starting at the first verse. It's entitled, Jesus Heals a Lame Man by the Pool. Some time later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for the feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralysed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day in which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is a Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. This is the word of the Lord.
That's an amazing story, isn't it? You know, one of the things that I recognise that the older I get, the more set in my ways I'm becoming. It's amazing how content you can be with the way things are in our lives, even though we know they're not the way they should be, not even the way they could be, but the hassle of changing is too much. It's amazing the difference that Jesus makes as he walks right into our lives and begins to really work and to really bring about change. But let me ask you a question. Do you really want Jesus to change you today? Or are you content just to stay the way that you are? When Jesus arrived in Jerusalem on this day, he was apparently alone, no mention of the disciples with him, and he finds his way to this famous pool. It's believed that Bethesda was the most amazing pool in the whole world because it was well known for this place of healing. It was said that periodically an angel from heaven would miraculously stir the pool's water, and the first person who got into the water while the angel was still there would be healed. But honestly, it was probably no more than superstition. Actually, it was discovered that beneath the pool there is a subterranean stream which every now and again bubbles up and disturbs the water. But the belief in that day was that the first person to get into the pool after the waters were stirred would be healed from any illness from which they were suffering. And people came from near and far for the chance to be healed because they were desperate. And so there is desperation around this pool. It's a place of human suffering and misery because here the poorest lay, the helpless, the sick, the desperate. And here at this pool, day in and day out, they waited for the moving of the water. One of the men around the pool had been waiting 38 years for something miraculous to happen in his life. This man who is stuck in a hopeless situation for 38 years, he needed a miracle to lift him off that mat. And he faithfully lay there. as many others did, in the hope that this day, their day of healing, would come. All he was trying to do was to get down into the pool, and yet, to be honest, all it was false hope. Sadly, he had become so fixated on the pool's promise that he did not realize that one far greater than an angel was walking through the crowd that day, and that was Jesus. And Jesus is deeply moved when he arrives on the scene, because everywhere he turned, he could see and feel the despair gripping people around that pool. And as Jesus looks around the pool, he sees people who are sick, people unable to walk, people in chronic pain. It is a sight of overwhelming need. Yet one man, and only one man, catches Jesus' attention, because he sees this man who's been waiting almost 4 decades. He could sense the stirring of his Father's presence. Verse 6, when Jesus saw him and knew how long he had been ill, he asked him, "Would you like to get well?" When you read that verse, you can't help but think, what a strange question to ask. Of course this man wants to be well. Would anybody not want to be healed who has been lying paralyzed for 38 years? And isn't that the reason he's come to the pool every day, hoping that one day to get into it and to be healed and be well? But what did Jesus see in the man's heart that led him to ask such a question? I mean, this has been this man's life for 38 years. This is all this man has known in his life. This is the way things have been for him. I wonder, had this man lost all hope that his situation would really change? Or maybe was he even afraid of getting better because life would change dramatically for him and he'd have new responsibilities ahead of him if he were to be healed and able to walk again? And isn't it true that there's a strange security in all of our lives in keeping things the way that they've always been? Even though circumstances may be difficult, even though they're not the way you think they could be or should be. And there's a sense in which if Jesus touches this man's life on this day, if he heals this man, he will change this man's life for good. He will transform this man. He will forgive this man. And the changes that Jesus is about to bring in his life are going to be very real changes, dramatic changes. I mean, think about it. He's going to walk home. He's going to be able to go out and look for work. He's going to be able to do things he's never been able to do before. There's going to be a complete transformation that is going to come from one touch of Jesus on his life this day. Folks, let's be honest. Jesus touching your life and my life will bring about change. And that can be very unsettling, maybe disturbing, even frightening when you really think about that. So the question, do you fear the changes that Jesus might bring into your life? The changes that might happen if Jesus was really to touch some area of your life right now? You know, it's hard to believe that there were times throughout the Old Testament that the people of God, they didn't want change. Do you remember the time he brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery? And do you know what they said to him? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Leave us alone, Lord. Don't interfere in our lives because we don't want to change. We don't want to leave the security of what we have, even though they were in bondage. And if we're honest, we all kind of struggle with that issue because we can become content, even stuck to stay the way we are, where we are. But if we do, we will never experience the power of Jesus as he breaks into our lives and really begins to change and bring about transformation. Do you know the greatest tragedy in any Christian life? It's when we say to God, leave us alone. We just want to remain the way that we are. But as Jesus draws alongside this man on this day, as the living Jesus draws alongside us by his Spirit, sitting where we're sitting this morning, his questions are exactly the same as they were for this man. Do you want to? Do you want to be forgiven? Do you want to be released and that guilt taken away? Do you want to be set free and that emptiness inside you filled? Do you want to deal with the issues in your life that you've been avoiding with Jesus? And you can hear in this man's voice in verse 7, the disappointment, the discouragement in his complaint to Jesus. Sir, the sick man said, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. Sir, I'd love to be changed, but I don't have anybody to help me. Not true, because Jesus has walked up and is beside you, and he has the power to change your situation. It's not what he can't do, it's what Jesus can do for him. This man admits that he is helpless, and I want to say that is a good place to be. All he says to Jesus is this: what I've been doing for the past 38 years isn't working. I'm helpless. And the good news is that Jesus is able, and Jesus is willing to change this situation. Number 2, are you willing to obey Jesus and do whatever he tells you to do, even though it may seem impossible from where you're sitting right now, verses 8 to 9? I don't know how many people in the 38 years have carried this man to the pool, set him down, and how he got so used to that routine. But here's a stranger. He doesn't even know who Jesus is. How do I know that? Because later on the religious leaders will actually ask him, who healed you? And he's not sure. And yet here's Jesus engaging in conversation with him and about to speak life-changing words into his life that will transform him, commanding this man to do what is impossible for this man to do, to get up, pick up his mat and walk. Do you know what Jesus is asking? He's asking the impossible. And the impossible is a big ask. Actually, he's commanding this man, get up, pick up your mat and walk. For 38 years, this mat, this stretcher, has been carrying this man. And now he is going to get up and start carrying the mat. And Jesus asked this man to do the most awkward and natural thing that he could have ever attempted. He asked him to stand up after he had been lying down for 38 years. Can you imagine what that must have looked like? It must have looked awkward, this man standing for the first time. It must have felt so unnatural to him to get off that mat and stand up. And yet that's the first thing Jesus asked him to do, stand up. This is a complete turnaround in this man's circumstances and behaviour, his actions, his lifestyle, his way of thinking, his way of living. And there's no doubt about it that when anyone personally encounters Jesus, a miracle takes place in the heart, in the mind, in the soul, a complete turnaround in life. But God's life, God's transforming power only kicks in when we take God at his word and obey his word and do what he tells us to do. And let's be honest, do we really want to live? Really live an abundant, promised life that Jesus really does offer to us? Aren't you just tired of maybe stumbling and struggling and stuck in the same sins, the same character failings, of constantly thinking, why can I not deal with this? Why am I so powerless over that? Aren't we tired of even lacking self-worth, which makes our relationships at times dysfunctional because we don't know who we are? Aren't we just weary carrying around the same old stuff in our lives that just weighs us down, gets us down, pulls us down and keeps us down? The same old habits that we just carry on doing. Aren't you just exhausted, desiring stuff that doesn't satisfy? Tired of giving in to the same temptations? Struggling with the same addictions, tripped up by the same fears, the hang-ups about the past, trying to live up to the expectation of others. Folks, these burdens pull us down, get us down, and they often keep us down, if we're honest. They stop us from getting up and being who we were created to be and following after Jesus. This is not how God intends us to be. God has different plans for our lives. God invites you and me, like he invited this man on this day, to stand up, to stand in him, to stand with him and for him. Jesus came that you and I could stand, so that you too could experience Jesus' transforming power, that your story can become part of his story. You were made to stand and to walk and to run. You were made to be you. So the question, how do you describe the person you see yourself? Physically, emotionally, spiritually, potentially? And what are you trying to prove and to whom? What are you afraid of losing, giving up, if you really were to stand up and follow Jesus on his terms? And finally, number 3, There are very real challenges and very real consequences if we are truly going to follow Jesus. This man hardly knew Jesus when Jesus walked into his life that day. But as Jesus comes back to him in verse 14 and reveals more of himself to this man, Jesus then goes on to face him with the consequences and the challenges. Verse 14, but afterwards Jesus found the man in the temple and told him, now you are well, so stop sinning, or something even worse may happen to you. If you and I are serious about following Jesus as Christian believers, then we do need to deal ruthlessly, seriously, effectively with sin in whatever shape or form it shows up in your life and mine. This man has been unable to walk for 38 years, but on this day when he met Jesus, he got up, he walked away, he left behind those 38 years of misery. He stepped up and he stepped out and he left his mat and his old way of living behind. And Jesus is asking you the same question that he asked that man. Do you want to be healed? If you do, stand up and follow me. Step out of your comfort mat, out of your comfort zone, and start walking by faith. It means keep walking, keep following, keep taking steps of faith, keep obeying one step of faith at a time. So what step of faith are you willing to take right now to follow Jesus? That's a challenging question. It's a personal question which no one else can answer and respond to, only you this morning. Take time, think it through. I've asked Alex to share with us this morning just briefly what faith has meant to him, especially in this time of lockdown, as he continues to walk and follow after Jesus. So, Alex.
So Arthur asked if I could record a short video about my faith during lockdown, and so here I am. Now that GCSEs are cancelled, I suddenly have a whole lot more free time on my hands, and although a lot of that has been dedicated to Xbox, I've definitely been more conscious of my faith during lockdown than before it, and hence I've spent more time reading the Bible and in prayer. Reading my Bible in the evenings has got close to being a regular routine for me. If we're talking specifically, a few weeks ago I stumbled upon Hebrews 11, almost by accident. It quickly became one of my favourite chapters. It first defines faith in verse 1 as confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. It then goes on to summarise how by faith some of the key historical events in the Old Testament happened, from creation to the falling of the walls of Jericho and much more. How by faith followers of God conquered kingdoms, performed miracles and escaped death. The chapter finishes by emphasising how none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better. So yeah, go have a look at Hebrews 11. It's class. During lockdown, the Bible isn't the only book I've read, believe it or not. I also read this book here by Krish Kandiah, which is written by a Christian, but presents non-biased views for both Christians and atheists on the biggest arguments and problems they have with each other and their beliefs, and how we can all get on regardless. To describe it briefly, that is. So yeah, that's a brief wee summary about how my faith has helped me through lockdown. Thanks for watching.